stretch, adding to congestion. Still crawling out of Cambridgeshire into Essex down the M11, past the scene of an earlier collision just south of Junction 9, the Saffron Walden exit. And the A40 still closed out of London at Park Royal, just after Gypsy Corner. Emergency services are dealing with an ongoing incident causing long queues back to the Westway roundabout and on routes through Shepherd's Bush, Acton and Park Royal as you divert. In Gloucestershire, southwest of Gloucester, the A48 at Minsterworth closed following a serious two-vehicle collision. Long queues heading west into Huntley on the A40 as you divert. And trams are suspended in Manchester from Victoria to Exchange Square for emergency engineering works. And that's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
This is your chance to win our biggest prize of the year so far. First, there's a totally tax-free £10,000 in cash for you to spend this summer. Then, we want to send you on a bespoke 7-night small boat cruise for two worth £10,000. Thanks to Variety Cruises, you'll be able to choose from any of their 2025 Greek adventures and discover Greece like never before. And with flights, meals, drinks and excursions included, all you have to do is relax. We'll also give you these terrific travel treats. For another chance to win a prize worth over £20,000, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB04 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 26th of April. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
GB News brings you accurate reporting of the day's topical agenda.
When the news breaks, wherever and whenever it's happening,
we'll be there.
This is GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good evening, I'm Christopher Hope, in for Nigel Farage, who's feeling a bit under the weather tonight. Get well soon, Nigel. But the show goes on. Is it right to allow EU citizens the right to vote in the upcoming local and mayoral elections? With just weeks to go before voters cast their ballots on May the 2nd, I'll be asking polling guru Professor John Curtis how it is that 4 years, yes, 4 years after we left the European Union, EU citizens still have a vote in UK elections. Now, 10 Tory MPs will defect to Reform UK if Nigel Farage becomes leader of that party out of his retirement. That's according to business tycoon and former UKIP donor Aaron Banks. I sat down with Aaron Banks earlier today for my brand new podcast, Chopper's Political Podcast. We'll bring you exclusive footage of that interview tonight before it airs in full tomorrow morning. And after it emerged that more than a quarter of the UK's foreign aid budget is now being spent in Britain to house asylum seekers, I'll be asking, is this good value for money? All that and more on tonight's Farage show. But first, the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Chris, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB Newsroom tonight is that the former American footballer O.J. Simpson has died of cancer at the age of 76. His family said in an announcement this afternoon he died surrounded by his children and his grandchildren. O.J. Simpson was acquitted of killing his ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman in 1994 in a trial that gripped America. And almost 100 million people watched live television coverage of the now famous pursuit of O.J. Simpson, driving a white Ford Bronco followed by multiple police cars across LA. After his record-breaking career in the NFL, he became an actor and had roles in Naked Gun. But in 2008, he was convicted for his role in a Las Vegas armed robbery and served almost 9 years in prison. Here at home, institutional bias prevented further investigation of complaints made by sub-postmasters about the faulty Post Office Horizon IT system. Former Post Office Managing Director David Smith has been giving evidence today at the Horizon IT inquiry. And between 1999 and 2015, more than 900 sub-postmasters were prosecuted due to the flawed software. Mr Smith apologised today for a 2010 email he'd sent saying a pregnant sub-postmistress's prison sentence was brilliant news. A Moroccan asylum seeker on trial for the murder of a pensioner in Hartlepool told police he was motivated by the conflict in Gaza. 45-year-old Ahmed Ali denies murdering 70-year-old Terence Carney, as well as the attempted murder of his housemate Javed Nouri last October. He says he carried out the attacks as an act of revenge for what he called Israel's killing of children in the Palestinian conflict. He's also accused of assaulting 2 female police officers who'd interviewed him after his arrest. A change to family visa rules comes into force today as part of the government's plan to reduce immigration. It's part of the Home Secretary's promise to transform the UK's immigration system, cut off unfair levels of migration and ensure those arriving here don't burden the taxpayer. The measure will see the minimum income for a family visa rise by more than £10,000 to £29,000. That's an increase of more than 55%. And by early 2025, that'll increase once again 2 more times, rising to £38,700. And lastly, a new poll suggests Rishi Sunak and other Conservatives may keep their seats in the next general election because of voter ID confusion. A poll that's been released today by the campaign group Best for Britain found 16% of people didn't know they'd need a photo ID to vote in upcoming general and local elections. That means around 5 million people could be turned away from polling stations, the poll says. The government passed the legislation in 2022 and the new rules came into force last year. That's the news. For the latest stories, do sign up for GB News Alerts. Scan that QR code on your screen right now or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Now, when Britain voted to leave the European Union in June 2016, all those years ago, few people would have thought that 9 years later, EU citizens will still automatically have the right to vote in British elections. But that's exactly what's happening. Why? Well, because of changes to the Elections Act in 2022 of local voting rights for EU citizens, well, they will not take effect until immediately after the May 2024 election. So tonight, I'm asking you a simple question. Is this right? Should millions of EU citizens be able to vote in the upcoming May elections? Email me, farage@gbnews.com, or on X, tweet the hashtag #FarageOnGBNews with your comment. Now, let's turn to polling expert, the legend that is the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, Sir John Curtis. Sir John, welcome to Farage on GB News. Great to see you there.
Hi, Christopher.
Can you explain, just for laymen, why are EU citizens voting in UK elections so long after we left the European Union?
Well, it's a perfectly good question, though I'm going to disappoint you because I'm actually going to tell you that actually, for the most part, EU citizens are going to keep their rights to vote in elections even beyond these 2024 local elections. What the government has decided to do is to allow anybody who was already resident in the UK up to the end of the transition period, that is to the end of 2020, to keep the voting rights they acquired as EU citizens. And I think that, at least it seems to be regarded as maintaining fairness to the EU citizens who already had that right to vote.
Yeah.
What will end after these local elections is the right of those EU citizens who have come to the UK since the end of the transition period, unless they come from Spain, Portugal, Luxembourg, or Poland, because in the case of those 4 countries, we have reached a reciprocal agreement whereby British citizens will continue to have the right to vote in local elections there. And in return for that, the United Kingdom is going to retain the right, even for new migrants from Spain, Portugal, etc., to vote here. So the number of people who are going to fall off the register, well, at the moment, it's reckoned there are about 2 million EU citizens on the register. That's about 5% of the electorate able to vote in local elections, not in the general election. It's reckoned only around 120, 130,000 of them will be taken off. As I understand it, probably the reason why it's not already taken effect is that what returning officers are going to be required to do under the law is to spend 3 months trying to work out which of the EU citizens that are on the register will still have the right to be on the register because they were here before the end of 2020. And I suspect, therefore, what the government decided was we better not do that just before the local elections, because that's going to cause all sorts of mayhem. Okay. Although, of course, it will be something the returning officers will have to cope with between now and next year's local elections, with, of course, a small matter of a general election to sort out along the way.
Goodness gracious. Let's a few quick questions then. It only affects local elections and mayoral elections, not the general election. Is that right?
Correct. And it also affects the PCC election. I should also say, however, it doesn't affect local elections in either Scotland or Wales or the devolved elections, because both in Scotland and in Wales, the devolved institutions have decided that anybody who is permanently resident in Scotland or in Wales, irrespective of their citizenship, will now have the right to vote. And that's already been implemented in both parts of the UK.
And that includes Holyrood elections to the Scottish Assembly and the Senate?
It means American citizens, Brazilian citizens. So it's long been the case that Commonwealth citizens could vote here, and that right will still remain. But if you live in Scotland or in Wales, whether you're EU or non-EU, anybody who is resident here that already has the right to vote in local elections.
Extraordinary. And do they have to be living here to vote, or can you move to Spain or wherever and then vote by post?
Well, that's right. We're now talking about British citizens. British citizens, the right of British citizens to vote while living abroad actually has been extended. There was a time limit. That time limit has now been got rid of. And to that extent, at least so far as general elections are concerned, not local elections, the rights of British citizens living abroad have now been extended.
And EU citizens who go home, can they maintain a right to vote in the UK having left?
Once they're no longer resident here, they will lose their right to vote.
Is this at all... It's done to allow for an unwinding of the arrangement to being part of the European Union, but is it... Do you find it surprising or acceptable, or kind of a very British way to get round a difficult situation?
Well, I mean, I think you have to ask yourself, Christopher, well, why is it that somebody who was born in southern Ontario and who comes to the UK to live can vote, while somebody who comes from northern Michigan cannot? The truth is that our rules on voting are a result of historical accretion. We have long, as I said earlier, allowed Commonwealth citizens to vote. We have long allowed Irish citizens to vote. Then when we joined the EU and the EU introduced local elections, voting for EU citizens, we added that too, though only for local elections. At some point, there is an argument for saying we ought to look at this sensibly and decide, well, is this only for British citizens? In which case we make it only for British citizens. Or, as Scotland and Wales have decided, well, actually, we allow anybody who is permanently resident here to vote. Those are at least two logical positions. What we've got at the moment is, frankly, a bit of a historical potpourri.
But it should sort itself out, is what you're hoping. It just seems extraordinary that with 9 years after we leave the EU, we're still giving the rights to vote on elections in this country to EU citizens.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I entirely understand your point. But the truth is, history keeps a long legacy, and the right of EU citizens who are already here before we got out of the EU, that right has been retained and will be retained even after these local elections. We can argue about it, but
Of course.
That's the historical legacy that we've decided to retain.
And just finally, Sir John, and thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for giving us the chapter and verse for our viewers and listeners, and they'll be responding to what you'll say. Are we over generous? Are other countries as generous as we are about the right to vote?
Well, as I've already suggested, I mean, Scotland and Wales are not unique in moving towards residently-based systems. Around a half or so of EU countries give non-citizens the right to vote, irrespective of whether they're from the EU or not. And those countries actually also, UK citizens living there will also be able to vote. So in other words, there is actually something of a move, certainly within Europe, towards a residency-based qualification rather than a citizenship-based one.
Well, listen, Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, thank you for joining us, explaining that to our listeners and viewers on Farage on GB News. Thank you. Well, today marks the first day of an asylum seeker standing trial at Teesside Crown Court, accused of the murder of a pensioner in Hartlepool and the attempted murder of his housemate. This is the story we have covered at the time on this programme, and GB News reporter Anna Riley has been watching in court, watching the first day unfold, and is there in Middlesbrough for us now. Anna, what's the latest?
Well, Chris, a jury today heard at Teesside Crown Court that Moroccan asylum seeker 45-year-old Ahmad Alid, who is on trial for the murder of a pensioner and the attempted murder of his housemate, told police that he was motivated by the conflict in Gaza and to further his desire that Palestine would be free from the Zionists. Now, the 45-year-old denies murdering 70-year-old Terence Carney in Hartlepool town centre, as well as the attempted murder of his housemate, Javid Nouri, on Sunday, the 15th of October last year. We heard from the prosecution that Alid was living in Home Office accommodation along with 3 other asylum seekers, one of these being Javid Nouri, and they heard that the pair initially got on and that the defendant believed that Javid Nouri was a Muslim because of his cleanliness, but it was when Mr. Nouri started attending church and converting from the Islam faith to Christianity that things broke down between the two, and that Mr. Nouri then went on to contact police because he felt threatened by the defendant. It was then heard that on the 15th of October, in the early hours of the morning, that the defendant entered Mr. Nouri's room as he lay sleeping and stabbed him multiple times while shouting Allahu Akbar, meaning God is great. Another housemate contacted police, and that 999 call was played to the jury, in which the cries of Allahu Akbar were heard. Now, Mr. Nouri managed to fight off the defendant due to his larger size and eject him from his room. Then we heard from the prosecution that the defendant went out into Hartlepool and stabbed Terence Carney to death as he was out on his morning walk. Police then managed to apprehend the defendant, and we heard from body cam footage that was shown that recorded him in the custody suite, which was played to the jury. He said that he launched into a speech in Arabic, and he said that for the people of Gaza and Allah willing, Gaza would return to be an Arab country, and that he then went on to praise Allah and spoke of him being displeased with those who went astray. He spoke about Palestine and said that Jews had divided Arabs, and said that his hands were injured. Otherwise, he would have continued what he referred to as the raid. He then was the next day interviewed by police, and in this he made several statements saying that the murder of Mr. Carney and Javid Nouri's attempted murder was in revenge for what he believed to be the killing of children by Israel, and that he said they killed children and I killed an old man. He said that 2 victims being lost was better than the whole of Britain being lost, and said the attacks were for the sake of Palestine so that we could live in peace. The interview concluded with the defendant swearing to Allah that he was ready for Shadahar, martyrdom, and then the prosecution go on to say that he attacked 2 female police officers and that his own solicitor had to make a 999 call for assistance. This trial will continue for around 4 weeks, and we will be providing the latest updates as that trial continues.
Anna Riley, thank you. Now, coming up, we'll be hearing from British businessman and former UKIP donor, Aaron Banks. And he doesn't hold back on what he thinks will happen if Nigel Farage, yes, that man again, returns to the political fold later this year. This is Farage with me, Christopher Hope, on GB News.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
SUV drivers in Oxford will face higher parking charges. Proposals tabled by the local Green Party or passed by the City Council. The motion argues that heavier cars like SUVs cause more damage to roads, are more likely to seriously injure or kill pedestrians, and cause more illnesses due to pollution. However, the Alliance of British Drivers has condemned the plan as absolutely outrageous. Well, let's get the thoughts now of the legendary motoring journalist, Quentin Wilson. Quentin, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. We hear a lot about the war on motorists, this time targeting SUVs because of their weight, and the charges could be astronomical. This idea first started in Paris. Now it's coming to Oxford. Can you tell us a bit about how it would work?
OK, so the idea is that the charges will penalise people who drive heavier SUVs and I guess by implication electric cars, although Oxford Council haven't said exactly what they're going to do with EVs. But this is all based around this notion of SUVs being heavier than passenger cars, therefore wearing out the roads more. Now, there was a study, I've got it here in front of me, from the University of Edinburgh in 2022 that said real-world tests found that overwhelmingly the wear is caused by large vehicles, buses, heavy good vehicles. Road wear from cars and motorcycles is so low that this is immaterial. Now, obviously, driving around a medieval city like Oxford in an SUV isn't the brightest thing in the world to do. But the idea that we should penalise the owners of these cars based on imperfect science that's been read on social media, I think is completely wrong.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now, before the break, I asked you if you thought it was right that EU citizens would be able to vote at the upcoming May elections. And here's what you had to say. Pam says only British voters should be allowed to vote in the UK. I'm sure British citizens cannot vote in the EU. Patricia says no, they should not be allowed to vote in the UK elections. No exceptions. Terry says EU citizens should absolutely not be allowed to vote! ! This once great country is going right down the pan. And Sally says the world's gone mad. This cannot be right. No, no, we should refuse. Keep them coming in. I will be reading them out on air through the show. Now, earlier today, I sat down for an explosive interview with Aaron Banks, the former UKIP donor and multi-millionaire businessman. You can catch the full podcast from 6 a.m. tomorrow on Spotify, YouTube, GB News' website, or wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, here's a sneak preview. You won't want to miss it.
Frankly, the polls are suggesting that Rebel Tory is going to be completely
could dozens come
one-ton.
across?
I think more than dozens.
Tory
I
MPs
actually generally say that because, you know, they're at a point where they can't win as a Conservative, but they might have half a chance as a Reform candidate.
When you say that you think,
yeah.
Or do you know names that you can't say now, or you can say now?
I know at least 3 or 4 names of
who are in talks now.
Yeah, that people are talking about it, and I would expect this just to accelerate. But this is the Farage factor, that if he comes back and then they pick up another 2 or 3 points in the polls. So Richard Tice has done a good job, but I think when you see 15 points in the polls, that's really the hope factor that Nigel's coming back.
Right.
But actually, if he does come back and gets traction, and you start to see, I think there's some polls out already saying that they're ahead with men in the Midlands.
That's
and
right. If you break it down,
they're already leading in certain places. And I think the Tory party have given up on that. They know they're going to lose, so they're trying to focus on, re-emergence of One Nation, soft Tory, and the MP for Reigate. It's that kind of Tory MP.
So to be quite clear, if Nigel Farage came to lead Reform UK,
I think 10 Tory MPs will walk across the thing straight away. And I think as well, that's part of his calculus. MPs are in contact with him daily about this kind of thing. And I think, if he does come back, it will be on the back of something fairly spectacular.
Fairly spectacular interview indeed. Now, joining me now to discuss this is Conservative Home's Deputy Editor, Henry Hill. Henry, good evening.
Good evening.
Did you hear Aaron Banks there, Henry? He's saying there that the Farage factor could pull 10 Tory MPs across to Reform UK if Farage decides to take a leading role in the party.
I did hear him. We've heard this before, of course. When Nigel Farage was leader of UKIP, there was constant talk of defections, and they got 2 in the end. The rest of them never materialised. Nigel Farage is very good at sort of playing footsie with the Conservative Party and constantly encouraging speculation about defections. I think because he realises that his party, whichever party it is usually most effective when it's spooking the Conservatives into doing something. I think the challenge for Reform is that whilst it is true that Nigel would lift their performance and that would potentially tempt some Conservative MPs, especially given the party's dire state in the polls, Reform, unlike UKIP, doesn't have a ground machine. It doesn't have an activist base. It has no track record of posting significant electoral victories. It's only ever managed to get a double-digit vote share in 2 by-elections. And so you're joining a much less convincing ship than UKIP was a few years ago. And given that UKIP only managed to get 2 defections, it would be interesting to see how many Tory MPs really thought that they would have a better chance of holding their seat as a Reform candidate without access to Conservative money and potentially with hardly any activists on the ground.
It's all about data, isn't it? So we certainly found when I was covering UKIP in previous jobs that they had no idea where their voters were, whereas the established parties do know where their voters and supporters are, and they can go and knock them up again and get the vote out.
Yeah, absolutely right. If you defect, you don't take your data with you. You also probably don't take many of your activists with you, those ground troops who do most of the work. Even when UKIP had lots of activists, it had a persistent problem that they were really happy to leaflet. They would leaflet until they dropped dead in the street, but they didn't like canvassing. And canvassing is how you collect that all-important voter information. So that, I think, is the challenge. If Aaron Banks or Nigel Farage says a Conservative MP is going to have a better chance of holding their seat as Reform, that claim is really that the Reform brand can do all the work, and I don't think that's the case.
What do you think to Aaron Banks' contention there that the 15 points that Reform UK hit last week, their highest, I think, in one of the polls, there's a lot of, he called it the hope factor in there, in the sense that people are almost banking on a Farage return, and if Farage ruled himself out and said, I want Reform, or people who might vote Reform, to go with the Tories and try and prevent a Keir Starmer supermajority at the election, then that number might fall down quite a lot.
It definitely might if Nigel went so far as to urge people not to vote Reform, although I don't think he'll do that. But it's certainly the case that Nigel would substantially increase Reform's chances. One, because he is a standout campaigner, a really rare political talent. But 2, because unlike Richard Tice, he knows that the way that you win over wavering Tories is that you butter them up. Right? He was always very good at being like, well, the Conservatives, I wish the Conservatives left me. Whereas Richard Tice is always, we need to smash and destroy the Conservative Party, which is much less effective. But you are right. If Farage actively anti-endorsed Reform and endorsed the Conservatives, I don't think that would do him any favours, but it certainly wouldn't do Reform any favours.
Or even if he just said, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to fight for Trump this year.
Yeah, if that happened, reform would suffer. Partly because it would be a signal that he didn't really have all that much confidence in reform. You'd think that given the party is polling as well as it is, that he would be interested in fighting that battle here in Britain. Yep. And if his informed position as somebody who presumably knows reform very well is that actually he'd much rather be overseas, that does tell voters something important about the real state of the Reform Party.
And away from the Tory Reform UK psychodrama, the other parties, Labour, are rubbing their hands, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The Tories are in a really invidious position now because they are losing votes to Reform, but they're also losing votes to the Liberal Democrats and to Labour. And of course, the problem is that those parties are the ones that will probably actually take Tory seats. So the CCHQ constantly needs to think, if it tacks to the right to try and box out Reform UK on this or that issue, is it going to save more votes and in the right places than it is going to potentially lose to moderate or wavering Conservative MPs in the South, in the Midlands, in North Wales and other key battlegrounds?
Do you think that the media, everyone is obsessing too much about Farage, that he's got an overblown importance now in the political debate?
Potentially, he has earned it. He is the single most important factor in the delivery of Brexit, and that can't be taken away from him. But I think that UKIP was so effective because UKIP had one ask, a referendum on the European Union, and Nigel Farage knew that the way to get that was to pressure the Conservatives into delivering it. And he was very, very good. UKIP was at its most effective when the Tories were changing policy to try and deal with UKIP. Reform is not in that position. It doesn't have a single clear ask. Richard Tice and the other leadership figures keep making it clear that they hate the Conservative Party and they're not interested in a deal. And that means that they don't have that ability to shape the debate in the same way. And also, UKIP came second in 100 seats in 2015. If we hadn't had the referendum on the European Union, they had a town hall presence, they would have become a substantial parliamentary force as a minor party. Reform has reset the clock on all that work.
Yeah, and the branding is any good, Reform UK? I mean, there's shades, I think, going back to Canada, I think, the Reform Party, but does it cut through for you?
Not really. It's too vague. Also, Reform UK is slightly corporate. The Reform Party in Canada was called the Reform Party. Reform UK sounds like a lobby group or something like that. It's too vague. I think the problem for Reform is that their policies, when you actually drill down into them, are in the wrong place, right? The big gap especially as a vulnerability for the Conservatives, is those voters who they won over in 2019. It's voters in the Red Wall and other areas who still lean left or who are lean right on social issues and law and order, but do actually lean left on the economy. And what Reform offer instead, really, is they offer sort of reheated Thatcherite economics, because most of them are Tory defectors, and then a load of sort of self-indulgent Liberal Democrat-style constitutional reform, which is very obviously about just helping Reform win more seats. So their offer is miscalculated. And I think one thing Farage would do if he came in is he would give that a serious overhaul, because one thing he's very good at is finding hot-button issues and putting his party on the right side of one or two.
Well, for now, Farage is a presenter on GB News, but has made clear he'll decide what to do in coming weeks. We'll get you back on, Henry, to discuss that. But Henry Hill from Conservative Home, thank you for joining us tonight on Farage on GB News. Now, coming up, as the channel crisis continues, it's now emerged that £4.3 billion of our aid budget is being spent here at home to help with housing refugees and asylum seekers, rather than being spent abroad, where it's meant to be spent. I speak with Dr. Tamsin Barton, the Chief Commissioner of the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, next.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update. Well, it will be a cloudy start tomorrow, but it should brighten up later on in the day. But for the far northwest, we're likely to see fairly persistent rain. High pressure is starting to spread its influence into southern areas of the UK, but further north and west, we'll see weather fronts push in through the next few days. And this evening, much of the rain will be restricted to the far north and west of Scotland. Also, parts of northwest England, Cumbria will likely see some heavy bursts of rain throughout this evening. Elsewhere throughout the night, it should stay largely dry away from the coasts and over the hills, but it's going to be a very cloudy and mild night. Temperatures again double digits for a minimum. Across the far northeast of Scotland, it should be a fairly dry and bright start, perhaps some areas in the Midlands as well, but by and large it's going to be a fairly cloudy start to the day. It'll likely stay quite cloudy and wet for much of the day across parts of western Scotland, northwest England, Northern Ireland as well, but elsewhere it should brighten up and it'll feel fairly warm once again in that sunshine. We could see temperatures as high as 21 degrees on Friday. That band of rain becomes a more weak feature, but it will sink into more northern areas of Wales, more widely across northern England, perhaps into the Midlands later on in the day and Saturday. Behind it, it turns much more unsettled, some showery outbreaks of rain, and it'll also turn considerably colder for those northwestern areas. But in the south, it should remain largely dry and bright for the weekend.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threats on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me. My guest and I tackle the issues that really matter, with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country. That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Now, new figures show that the UK houses so many asylum seekers that nearly a third of our aid budget is being spent on people, asylum seekers living here. And with me now is Dr. Tamsin Barton from the Independent Commission for Aid Impact. Dr. Barton, why is it that our government's allowed to spend aid money here?
So the UK, along with other donors that belong to the OECD think tank, Development Assistance Committee, is allowed to spend money which counts as humanitarian spend in the country that they're paying from or other countries where refugees are housed. That's allowed in the rules, but it isn't counted by everybody. In fact, the UK used not to count this until 2010, where it changed its position. But the reason it's come to the fore now is because that spend has increased so much.
So 28% is a lot, isn't it? I mean, that's 4.3 billion, as you say in your report.
So it's actually even more than last year. So we were expecting that it would go down a bit. Last year it was 3.7 billion, and we were told that was because there were so many people coming from Ukraine, there were people coming from Afghanistan, and it can only be charged to the aid budget for the first year. So you'd expect the cost to go down if it was about Ukraine and Afghanistan. But clearly that wasn't the main driver of the cost. What you're still seeing is very high costs of accommodation for asylum seekers and refugees.
So the failure of the Home Office to deal with the small boats crisis, possibly, means that we're spending aid money here when it should be helping people who need it in poorer countries.
Well, it's obviously much more equitable to provide that aid where it's needed the most, so that it can make the most difference. But the other thing that we don't like about it and why we've criticised it as being inefficient is thinking about the taxpayer more broadly, not just in relation to the aid budget. So in this strange setup where they have to manage to hit this aid target, like landing the helicopter on the handkerchief, the Foreign Office...
0.5% of GDP.
Exactly. They're aiming at 0.5. The way it works is that the Foreign Office is the spender and saver of last resort. And that's because it has the ability to move funds across financial and calendar years for various reasons I could go into, and the other departments don't. But that poses a massive problem if it means that the Home Office, which is mostly, it's about more than 2/3 of these costs, is able to spend as much as it likes without any impact on its own budget. Now, that's completely against the normal way in which government
So the Home Office has doesn't really require to bring down the hotel's bill because it's not their bill, it's paid for by the Foreign Office.
That's how it ends up working. Now, we realise it's not that the Home Office is trying to waste money, but it's not the right incentives. They're not feeling that pain in their pockets.
It's someone else's money, and you know how Whitehall works. It's not my budget, Governor.
So that is something that clearly just isn't a sensible way to manage a budget. So that's where we feel that having a target managed in this way makes no sense. Anyway, what it's led to is a situation where the incentives for the Home Office are more to respond in the short term. So there's a lot of criticism, so they will try and find alternative sites to reduce costs, but they do not focus on a long-term solution to get away from this crisis, because for the long term, the way you can reduce these costs for the taxpayer in general is that you need to have cheaper accommodation, which is more suited to people who need to be living in the community in flats and in houses like they used to before COVID, when they started being put in hotels.
But is it right, though, that we're spending aid money on poor people who are arriving here from overseas? So is it in better value for the taxpayer, given that 0.5% of our national income is given over to helping those much less fortunate than ourselves? If they're in the UK, that's fine, because we're helping them, aren't we, wherever they are?
Well, we'd certainly agree with the principle of humanitarianism that nobody should be left destitute without the basics of shelter, food, etc. But spending the money this way is not the best use of taxpayers' money, because in effect what you're ending up doing more is subsidising hotels than actually providing humanitarian services.
Now, the target was 0.7%, wasn't it? And, of course, in that period you mentioned there, it went up to about 0.7% became law, I think, in 2014. It's now down to 0.5%.
Yes.
We've now gone past the end of the financial year. What was the amount of our GDP spent on aid in the last financial year?
Well, just to be confusing, the OECD DAC measures by calendar year.
I know, yes.
And that doesn't always fit with the way budgets work. And that is why, in actual fact, in this year, it's ended up being 0.58, so it's nearer to 0.6. In which year, the financial year? 2023, the year that we're looking at.
The calendar year?
The calendar year.
Was 0.58?
It was 0.58, and that is because the Treasury, when they saw in 2022 that the Foreign Office basically had to pause its entire aid spending, so it didn't have money when the Pakistan floods happened, for example, they weren't able to pay where they legally had to pay. They realised that they needed to provide some extra. So what they did was they provided an extra £2.5 billion over 2 financial years.
Right.
And the way that ended up, so they were thinking, we'll have a maximum of 0.55.
Is that a buffer then, basically?
It's a buffer, and actually we have suggested that if they're going to have this target, it's much better not to try and be so exact. That leads to more value for money.
Landing a helicopter on a moving vessel.
You'll spend money unnecessarily one year. You're going to be overspending, and then you could be underspending when you need to be spending.
0.58 is a huge overspend of it on the aid budget.
Well, over the 2 years, it probably would have ended, because it was 0.51 in the previous
It's still
year.
over 0.5.
It's over 0.5. And
for 2 years running.
It is over 0.5, but then there's back to the question, most people don't think the aid budget is being spent on people seeking asylum here or refugees. So actually you've got such a huge chunk, 28%, that's where it's being spent.
Yeah.
So then we certainly don't take a position, that's for politicians and ultimately people voting for them to decide where the money should be spent. Our job is just to scrutinise how the aid budget is spent. Is it good value for money? Is it reaching the people that need it the most?
And what's your view on the aid budget generally? It has been criticised, hasn't it, by some newspapers for spending money on frivolous schemes?
Well, we don't have a view as such on it in general, but we review it. We provide reports, maybe 8 a year, to the International Development Committee in Parliament. And what we do for our sort of most thorough reviews, we score them. And to give you a sort of quick snapshot, a little bit less than 2/3 we view as broadly satisfactory. That's the way I can give you the sort of highest level picture.
So a third are not satisfactory.
So a third have very concerning features, but some positives.
Yes.
So that's what we call an amber red score. We give it. And what we've done in this case, actually, we had a review which didn't have a score because it was what we call a rapid review, but we have scored the follow-up process. So this is a year on from our review. We gave them recommendations. They rejected 2 of them, which is unusual. But of the 4 that were left, we looked as hard as we could for improvements. There were some. They have improved a little bit their contract management, but ultimately they haven't done the big things that make a difference.
But just going back to this, the 28% of the foreign aid budget spent in the UK, we're not going to get wrapped on the knuckles by the UN.
No, not as such, but the chair, I was on an event with him recently, the chair of the OECD DAC has made some comments in what's called the peer review, which is basically encouraging the government to look at why it is in the UK. Last year, it was twice as much as a percentage of the average of DAC donors. Well, we think, based on our report, that they're counting everything that you could possibly imagine you could charge to the aid budget. That's why it's so much of it.
Listen, Dr. Barton, it's great to chat through the aid budget and understand why that money's being spent here. Thank you for coming to the studio and joining us tonight. Thank you. Now, my what the Farage moment is that it's been announced that naval recruits no longer need to be able to swim. Yes, you heard that right, folks. If recruits fail a swimming test, they simply stay in phase 1, while they're then given lessons. At this rate, we can't be very far from pilots who can't fly planes and teachers that can't teach. I'm not quite sure why the Royal Navy stood to attention wearing inflatable armbands is really going to scare the enemy. Coming up, we looked ahead to one of the biggest races of the year, the Grand National, with horse racing expert and the legend that is Derek Tomo Thompson. See you shortly.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Offline and overlooked. That's what Age UK say millions of British pensioners are. Why? Because they cannot or won't access the internet. It's leading to digital exclusion. So the charity's campaigning for public services like banks, utilities and even the NHS to maintain a more human approach.
Everything's online. People assume you've got a smartphone with a mobile number and an email, and without that you don't exist in this world anymore. We've got to try and get the government to see that it's so important to make people feel that they belong, because there's a feeling that the older generation just feel that they're forgotten, they're in the way, and we already know that anyway, but it's just another reason for them to feel that they're not wanted. They'll just accept it and they'll say, well, that's it, I can't do it anymore, and that's it, whereas other people would be really kicking and screaming. So we need to be the voice for older people.
Despite digital technology playing an increasing role in our lives, around 1 in 5 over 65s in the UK don't use the internet. Thornycroft Centre in Pontefract, West Yorkshire provides a space for this age group to socialise and get help to go online.
I'm not that good with mobiles, so when you mention anything about online, I ain't a clue what you're talking about.
The closure of thousands of banks is also detrimental to the older generation.
A lot of our members what come, they tend to use cash. They don't like to use bank cards. I think a lot of it's trust or the lack of knowledge. They don't understand how it works. I think they're very vulnerable as well with online. It's really important that they're aware how to use it and how to use it safely.
So, in an online era, it's still crucial for many to have an offline option.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Now for something a bit more light-hearted. Today saw the start of the 2024 Aintree Grand National Festival, with punters flocking into the famous racecourse near where I grew up in Liverpool ahead of the main event on Saturday. However, following safety concerns, the historic race, which dates back to 1839, has been changed. Joining me to discuss the changes to the race and hopefully give me the winning tip for Saturday is the legend himself, Derek Tomo Thompson. Tomo, if I may, good evening.
Chris, are you well?
I'm definitely well. It's great to see you again, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm sorry I'm replacing your friend Nigel tonight. Just very briefly, has Health and Safety got at the great old Grand National?
No, it is still the greatest race in the world. It is unique, as you said. It started in 1839, and a horse called Lottery won the first ever Grand National. And that's what the Grand National is. As you know, it's a lottery. And there was a jockey called Captain Beecher. He fell off at the sixth fence, and that's why the sixth fence is called Beecher's Brook. So it's been going for hundreds of years. It is absolutely incredible. And yes, they have tweaked it a little bit. There used to be 60-odd runners years ago. It was reduced to 40. Now it's reduced to 34 runners. They've shortened the trip. It's not 4.5 miles anymore. It's just over 4.25. And it's going to be a standing start. So they can't come in, cantering in and going fast. So, and the stewards will say to the jockeys, now, don't go crazy going down the first fence. They always do that. But, of course, you know what it's like. If you're driving in a Grand Prix, you want to try and make the event in first place.
Are you worried about the changes, or are they sensible? Are you someone... I mean, obviously, we must mourn always when horses die in the race, but part of the horse's appeal is the danger. But, of course, no one wants to see deaths.
No, I'm the first one. My love is horses. I've lived with horses all my life. So my love is horses, and I wouldn't do anything that they didn't want to do. And horses, there were a couple of fallers today, but they were galloping alongside. In fact, a loose horse won a race today. It was lovely to see. Obviously, he couldn't win without the jockey, and the jockey was okay. So these things happen. So, yes, in the old days, the fences were much more difficult, much steeper and all that, and it was much harder to win. But that's what gives the race that extra. Now, obviously, the fence is a little bit lower, so in a sense, that's making them safer. But at the same time, then it allows the horses to run a bit faster. Yeah. Having said that, the ground's going to be pretty testing. It was lovely weather today at the track, but then when we were coming out, it was starting to pour down. So the going's going to be, although full marks to the ground staff, they've done very well. The ground's going to be, there ain't going to be any course records this weekend.
Well, back in the 1990s, Tomo, there used to be a fun run on the Sunday after the Grand National when you could run and jump over the fences yourself, and I did that with ladders. And those fences are pretty painful, aren't they? Because it's a Christmas tree that you're jumping over, and it can scrape your legs quite badly. I went round in a long time, let me tell you.
Well done. Did you win?
No, it was everyone's wearing fancy dress. It was a charity fun run over the national jumps.
Well done, Chris. Well done for doing it. You raise money for charity. That's what it's about.
Absolutely. But yeah, it will be the same, won't it? There'll still be the excitement. I mean, 34 runners is a big field. It's not 60 as it was a few years ago.
No, it makes it a little bit easier for us commentators. I remember when we were commentating, you have 4 commentators on the Grand National, and in my day we had Peter Bromley, Michael Smith, Michael O'Hare, the great Irish commentator, and as they go over Valentine's, over to you, Derek Thompson, and I hand it back as they recross the Melling Road back to Peter Bromley. And, there are stacks and stacks of horses, and you've got to watch out for the fallers. You've got to say which horse is in front, which horse is behind. So it's not an easy job, I tell you, for the commentators on Saturday. But 34 runners is plenty, and it's round about 5-1 the field. And Corach Rambler, as you know, is favourite to win it. He won it last year, won it for Scotland. Derek Fox, the jockey, has won 2 Grand Nationals. Lucinda Russell, the Scottish trainer, has won 2 Grand Nationals with Corach Rambler. So who's to say the horse might win again? But the horse has gone up in the weights, so it's going to take a very good performance, despite finishing 3rd last time out in the Cheltenham Gold Cup.
You've given us the top runners there, but who's the Tomo tip? Obviously, we're not giving any advice here to any viewers or listeners, but just, a bit of fun.
Well, I'd love to see a trainer called Christian Williams train it, because his very young daughter, Betsy, is recovering from leukemia. And it'd be lovely if Kitty's Light, the horse he trains, could win. And, the Grand National has a habit of throwing up lovely stories like that. Bob Champion won it on Aldenity, raised so much money for the Bob Champion Cancer Trust. A couple of horses I like. James Reevely, who was born in North Yorkshire, but is the French champion jockey, comes over to ride a horse called Roy Marge. That was 7th last year, and he's much better off at the weight. So on the handicapping, he's got a good chance. And there's an amateur friend of mine called David Maxwell, who rides Ain't That a Shame. Now, they're both round about 50-1. Now, you never know. Anything could happen. Korak Rambakurum, there's a couple of long shots that could finish in the first 5.
Well, Tomo, I hope to be there on Saturday too, and if I bump into you, I'll buy you a pint. It's great to see you again. Thank you for joining us tonight on Farage.
I heard that. He's going to buy me a pint. I'll keep you to that. See you, Chris.
Great. And finally, a sweet ending to the show tonight. Market trader Kevin Hilliard, who was ordered to close his pick and mix stand in Suffolk after doing business for 25 years, has had his stall saved after the local council U-turned on its plans to use the market to focus on fresh produce only. And joining me now is Tory MP for Suffolk Coastal, Therese Coffey, who met Kevin yesterday. Therese, is this a victory for common sense?
I think so. Came as a surprise to people that this stall that had been there for a long time, all of a sudden was being told it wasn't, how can I put it, sufficiently on message for the people of Suffolk to be in this stall. And this is a market that's been there for hundreds of years. It's not quite as big as it used to be, but I was delighted this week to see Kevin back with his pick and mix, back in situ.
And there's a picture on screen now. What's your favourite pick and mix? So is that some cola bottles or some fangs in that bag there, Therese?
I've got a soft spot for licorice, but it's I was just relieved that the town council. I think this had been delegated to other people, and I'm glad that when the elected politicians came together, that they realised that this was a step too far. And, ultimately it's going to be about freedom of choice for people. Yeah. And instead of necessarily just buying from the supermarkets or wherever, that they can go and literally pick what they want.
You support your local market is the message, of course, it is Therese Coffey. How was Kevin? Was he upbeat? Was he joyful?
Yes, and I think he possibly got a bit more trade than perhaps usual because people were happy to see him there. But like a lot of things, shop local. And this is something he's been doing for years and caused no offence to anybody. I'm delighted that people can go and get their shrimps or whatever, their licorice or whatever it is, their cola bottles, as you say.
Well, Therese Coffey, thank you for joining us tonight on Farage with a happy ending to tonight's programme. Thank you. Now, coming up next on GB News is, of course, State of the Nation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob's with me in the studio now. Jacob, what's on your show tonight?
What am I going to be talking about? Well, there's this man at the UN who says we've got 2 years to save the world. Ooh. And as we're not going to save the world in 2 years by living in caves and not having any electricity and all this, I think we should give it up and just be sensible and have cheap energy and be competitive. I think he has blown the gasket on the green ideology.
Yes.
Well,
about fracking?
Well, our energy is 44 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity against 17 cents in the US, and this is having a terrible effect on our economy and the least well off in our society. So we need to do anything that we can to get the price down, and yes, I'd certainly include fracking in that.
Mm-hmm. And you're pushing for that in the Tory manifesto?
Well, I'm not sure the Tory manifesto is going to be written by me, but it seems a really sensible policy when we're sitting on all this cheap energy. And the green agenda is about state control and making people poor. It's become absolute hysteria, and 2 years to save the world is just absurd. It's sort of Looney Tune stuff.
Have you got a tip for the National?
Well, I was hoping it might be the Ditchit trainer Paul Nicholls, but he hasn't got somebody in Ditchit, of course, being in Somerset, and all the best things are in Somerset. So I'm going to go for Iron Maximus, merely because I love the name. I don't know anything about it.
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Nigel Farage, get well soon. Coming up, State of the Nation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. First, the weather with Annie Shuttleworth.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update. Well, it will be a cloudy start tomorrow, but it should brighten up later on in the day. But for the far northwest, we're likely to see fairly persistent rain. High pressure is starting to spread its influence into southern areas of the UK, but further north and west, we'll see weather fronts push in through the next few days. And this evening, much of the rain will be restricted to the far north and west of Scotland. Also, parts of northwest England, Cumbria will likely see some heavy bursts of rain throughout this evening. Elsewhere, throughout the night, it should stay largely dry away from the coasts and over the hills, but it's going to be a very cloudy and mild night. Temperatures, again, double digits for a minimum. Across the far northeast of Scotland, it should be a fairly dry and bright start, perhaps some areas in the Midlands as well, but by and large, it's going to be a fairly cloudy start.